Today we are going to complete our chapter 6 that will be about the environmental conservation, forests, grasslands, parks, and nature preserves. We will talk about what portion of the world's original forest remains and what activities actually they threaten the global forests, or what are the different steps that can be taken to preserve them. Also, we will talk about the road construction, which is a challenge to forest conservation, and what are the world's most extensive grasslands. We'll talk about them and how are the world's grassland distributed and what activities actually degrade those grasslands. We'll also talk about the original purposes of parks and nature preserves in North America and what are the different steps that will help to restore those natural areas. Let's start with a case study, which is about the palm oil and endangered species. So in this case study, which is about the palm oil and endangered species, we'll talk about that whatever donuts or the toothpaste or shampoo, or they actually we are using in our daily life, are they actually killing critically endangered orangutans and tigers in Sumatra and Borneo? So this is a good question. And how could that be possible, that the link is rapidly expanding those Indonesian palm plantations, which are destroying the habitat of some rare species like orangutans or tigers or some rhinos or elephants? What were once they were once some of the most highly productive and biologically diverse lowland rainforests in the world. They are rapidly being converted into palm monocultures that have no room for endangered species. So these rhinos, tigers, orangutans, or elephants, these are considered as endangered species. That means they are about to extinct. So in Indonesia, what does the orangutans mean actually? These orangutans, they are actually, it has been derived from two words. One is the orang means the people and utan means the forest. So orangutans are actually among the closest and most charismatic of our primate relatives. They share at least 97% of our genes. They are also among the most critically endangered of all the great apes. So it's estimated that between 1,000 to 5,000 of these shy forest giants, they are killed every year. By whom? By the lodgers or poachers. So today, only about 6,000 orangutans are left in Sumatra and about 50,000 in Borneo. The United Nations, it warns that unless current practices change, there may be no wild orangutans outside protected areas in a few decades. Palm oil is the most widely used vegetable oil in the world, and together, Indonesia and Malaysia, they currently produce about 90% of the global supply. We probably have eaten or used more palm oil than we are aware. At least half of the packed food that we use in our that we have in our local supermarket, along with a wide range of detergents, soaps, cosmetics, or other products, they are actually made with this palm oil. And where does this palm oil come from? So this comes from these forests, and palm oil consumption is currently growing very faster than any other food item. So cutting down those palm trees is actually affecting the rhinos, the orangutans or tigers, because that's the habitat for them, the forests. In 2000, Indonesia had about 2.5 million hectares of palm plantations. And over the past 15 years, that area has now grown to more than 11 million hectares producing around 35 million metric tons of palm oil per year. So Indonesia's palm operations are projected to double again. So it's estimated that by 2030, the Indonesia's palm operations, they are about to double. They are expected to double in 2030. So as these agribusiness companies, they slash, burn, or bulldoze those forests into neat rows of palm trees, they are not only eliminating the biodiversity, but they are also emitting certain greenhouse gases and destroying those livelihood of indigenous and traditional people. Or we can say that Indonesia, which is a nation of nearly 17,000 islands lying along the equator between the Southeast Asia and Australia, it has the largest area of rainforest in the world. So highest rate of deforestation of any country and the world's third highest greenhouse gas emissions. And the expansion of palm oil is a driving force in both forest destruction and climate changing gas releases. The process actually usually starts with logging to harvest. The many cases the fires cover up the illegal logging, and finally these vast areas are planted in sterile monotony. Or in short, we can say these oil palms are highly profitable, but a single hectare of palms can yield 30 metric tons of oil per year. But palm oil is now Indonesia's third largest import, so it brings about $18 billion annually. But one of the worst kinds of forest destruction for plantations is on deep peatlands, where those waterlogged soils they prevent the biomass decomposition. As we all know that the peat soils, they contain more than 28 times as much carbon as mineral soil, and draining and burning of a hectare of peatland, it can release about 15,000 tons of carbon dioxide. Unfortunately, while the international companies and the national government seem to want to do right thing, it's difficult to trace the source of all the lumber and oil. So this is especially true because it's estimated that the 80% of all logging and land clearing in Indonesia is illegal, and often it's done by some local authorities or the military. So still, it shouldn't be difficult to fulfill the promise to stop this destroying intact forests. Indonesia has more than enough degraded land to provide all the planned plantation expansion for the next 20 years. So that means that how these clearing those forests or logging or bulldozing those trees, the forest trees, they are actually uh, uh, affecting the habitat of those rhinos, tigers, or orangutans. So talking about the world forests, woodlands, pastures, and rangelands, they together occupy almost 60% of global land cover. These ecosystems provide many of our essential resources like the paper pulp, grazing land for livestock, the lumber. They also provide certain essential ecological services like they regulate the climate, control water runoff, provide the wildlife habitat, purify air and water, and also support the rainfall. So these forests and grasslands, they also have scenic and cultural and historic value. Forests also help to stabilize the climate by storing a lot of carbon. These forests, woodlands, and pastures and rangelands, they together occupy almost 60% of those global land cover. We have already studied the case study for the chapter, which shows that balancing or competing the land uses and needs can be complicated. So many conservation debates have concerned protection or use of the forests or prairies and rangelands. In this chapter, it examines the ways we can use we use and abuse these biological communities, as well as some of the ways we can protect them and conserve their resources. We will also discuss forests first, followed by the grasslands, and then the strategies for conservation, restoration, and preservation. So here in this figure, you can see that this gives us the world's land use and forest types, that how much area is under the boreal forests, about 33%. The tropical moist forests, they constitute about 42%. We have the tropical dry forests, about 5%. Subtropical forests, they constitute about the 9%. And then temperate forests, about 11%. So when we talk about the subtropical, so we have some others. That means this portion, which constitutes about 33%. The croplands, the pink one here, it constitutes about the 11%. So what's the other categories? It includes, which contributes about 30%. It includes all the tundra, these deserts, wetlands, and urban areas, which constitute about 33% of the land area. Talking about the boreal and tropical forests, which are most abundant, the forests are a huge carbon sink. That means it can store somehow about 422 billion metric tons of carbon in standing biomass. So clearing and burning of these forests is responsible for about 17% of all the carbon that's released by those human actions every year, more than all vehicles combined, and it's a major factor in global climate change. And moisture released from the forest, it affects the rainfall, not only locally, but sometimes far away also. For example, recent climate studies, they suggest that deforestation of the Amazon could reduce the precipitation in the American Midwest. Among the forests of greatest ecological importance are the remnants of primeval forests that are home to much of the world's biodiversity or endangered species and indigenous human cultures. Sometimes called the frontier forest, growth forest, or those that cover a relatively large area and have been disturbed by human activities long enough that trees can live out a natural life cycle and ecological processes can occur in a fairly normal fashion. So even though these forests, they still cover about half of the area they did worldwide, but only we see that one-fourth of those forests, they retain the old growth features. The largest remaining areas of old growth forest are Russia, Canada, Brazil, Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea. So forests, as we already discussed, that they are a huge carbon sink. So although the official data, it described only about one-fifth of the Indonesian these forests. So together these five countries, the Russia, Canada, Brazil, Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea, they account for more than three-quarters of all relatively undisturbed forests in the world. So in general, remoteness rather than the laws, they protect those forests. So although official data it described only one-fifth of Russian old growth forest as threatened, rapid deforestation because of both illegal and legal, especially in the Russian Far East. So probably puts a much greater area at sink. Talking about the tropical rainforest in Queensland, Australia, the primary or old growth forests such as this are not necessarily composed entirely of huge old trees. Instead, they also have some trees of many sizes and species that contribute to complex ecological cycles, and their relationships. Like in this figure here, you can see that forest area and annual net change from 2005 to 2010. The largest annual net deforestation rate in the world is in Africa. Here you can see. So this is the forested area and this is the percent change. So largely because China has planted many uh, 50 billion trees in the past decade, Asia has a net increase in forest area. Europe also is gaining some forest area, while North and Central America, they have had no net change. Like we already discussed that forests, they provide us many valuable products. They are a part in more activities of the modern economy than any other commodity. So 1/5 of all wood consumption is to produce the paper. Fuel wood accounts for about half of global wood consumption. You can hardly see any industry that doesn't use that wood or wood products somewhere in its manufacturing and marketing processes. For example, thinking about the amount of junk mail or newspapers or photocopies and other paper products that each of us use in developed countries, handles, stores, and disposes of in a single day. So total annual world wood consumption is about 4 billion metric tons. This is more than the steel and plastic consumption if we combine them together. Paper pulp, the fastest growing type of forest products, accounts for nearly a fifth of all wood consumption. Most of the world's paper is used in the wealthier countries of North America, Europe, and Asia. So global demand for paper is increasing rapidly. Talking about the monoculture forestry, so monoculture forestry like this, you can see in Wisconsin tree farm, it produces valuable timber and pulpwood, but has little biodiversity. Or we can say that approximately 1/4 of the world's forests are managed for wood production. So ideally, the forest management, it involves the scientific planning for sustainable harvests with particular attention that's paid to the forest regeneration. In temperate regions, according to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, more land is being replanted or allowed to regenerate naturally than it's being permanently deforested. So much of this reforestation, however, is in large plantations of single species or single use or intensive cropping, which is called as monoculture forestry. So reforestation of this kind, in which we plant a large number of single species that are used for single use, or we can say the intensive cropping, which is called the monoculture forestry. Although this produces rapidly growth and easier harvesting than a more diverse forest, a dense single species stand often supports little biodiversity and does poorly in providing the ecological services like the soil erosion control or clean water protection that may be the greatest value of native forests. Tropical forests are also being cleared rapidly. A century ago, it was estimated that about 12.5 million kilometers, an area larger than the entire US of tropics, were covered with closed canopy forests. The Food and Agriculture Organization now estimates that only about 40% of the forest remains in its original condition, and about 10 million hectares, about 0.6% of existing tropical forests, are cleared each year. Here you can see the forest destruction in Rondônia, Brazil between 1975 to 2001. So in 1975, there was not much deforestation, But in 1989, you can see here the white patches. This shows the deforestation that has occurred in 1989. And the 2001, you can see there is a vast destruction of these forests. The deforestation is at its peak. So what are the different factors? So the construction of logging roads, it creates a feather-like pattern that opens forests to settlement by the farmers. What are the causes of deforestation? Although loggers might take only one or two of the largest trees per hectare, the canopy of tropical forest is usually so strongly linked by the vines and interlocking branches that fell on one tree can bring down a dozen others. So in Africa, conversion of forest into small-scale agriculture, it accounts for nearly about two-thirds of all tropical forest destruction. In Latin America, the poor landless farmers, they often start the deforestation but are brought out or driven out after a few years by large-scale farmers or the ranchers. So building roads to remove those logs kills more trees, but even more important, it allows the entry to the forest by farmers, the miners, hunters, and others who cause further damage. One more factor is the cattle ranching that can increase the pressure for deforestation. Cattle ranching can increase pressure for deforestation, or we can say it can increase the pressure for forest destruction. But in the proper setting, cattle also can assist forest regeneration by dispersing seeds. So forest protection, talking about the forest protection, how can we finance the forest protection and restoration in developing countries? One of the few positive things that come out of recent UN climate conferences is an agreement to principle to found the REDD program. That's the RED program. And this REDD program, it accounts for the reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation in developing countries. This idea was actually first proposed by the Papua New Guinea and Costa Rica at international climate talks in 2005. The main aim of this program is to protect the existing forests and also to restore the degraded tropical lands. Administered by those United Nations Environmental Program, this mechanism, if it succeeds, it will present a massive transfer of money from rich countries to poorer ones as part of a commitment to reduce the impact of greenhouse gas emissions. These RED program schemes, they can pay for the ecosystem services. So it's increasingly clear that forests influence the global climate system. So wealthy countries are exploring ways to pay developing countries to keep their forests standing. So like we already discussed, the RED program, which is the reducing emission from deforestation and forest degradation, it's a global effort to do this. The hope is that payments can help the low income countries that develop the economic opportunities that doesn't require clearing and selling their forests. These agreements by wealthy countries to finance this RED initiative have been among the notable successes at recent global climate uh, conferences. So administering this program, the RED program, will not be easy. The United Nations estimates that fully funding forest protection will cost about $20 billion and $30 billion per year globally. The temperate forests, they are also at risk. Tropical countries are not unique in harvesting those forests at an uh, unsustainable rate. Northern countries such as United States and Canada, they have allowed controversial forest management practices in many areas. Or we can say that for many years, the official policy of US Forest Service was multiple use, which implied that the forests could be used for everything that we might want to do these simultaneously. Some uses are incompatible, however, bird watching, for example, it's not very enjoyable in an open pit mine. So protecting species that need the unbroken old growth forest is not easy when you cut down those forests. Talking about the old growth forests, some of the most continuous forest issues in the United States and Canada have centered on logging in old growth temperate rainforests in the Pacific Northwest. Many endemic species, such as the northern spotted owl, foxes, swift, and the marble murrelet, live nowhere else. Such forests have incredibly high levels of biodiversity, and they can accumulate about 5 times as much standing biomass per hectare as a tropical rainforest. So, if I ask a question that what drives this deforestation? So, there may be so many reasons for that. One is the industrial scale agriculture, like the soya and palm oil production, the cattle ranching, the industrial logging that's driven by the international demand for timber, poverty and pollution or population pressure as people seek farmland and fuel wood, the road development, which is one of the major causes for this deforestation, or the oil development, mining, and dams. And how these deforestation and degradation, they release the carbon. So when the trees are burned, they release the carbon which is stored in woods and leaves. The fallen vegetation, it decays and releasing stored carbon. The accumulation of carbon in soil litter or declines exposed soils dry, and carbon in soil oxidize to carbon dioxide. So the forest ecosystem is no longer available to store that carbon. So that's how this deforestation and degradation, it actually releases the carbon rather than the forests that are supposed to absorb that carbon or store that carbon. Let's move to the other topic, that's the old growth forests. How these old growth forests, they have been attacked. The huge trees of the old growth temperate rainforest accumulate more total biomass in standing vegetation per unit area than any other ecosystem. So these old growth forests, they provide habitat to many rare and endangered species. But nowadays they are converted by loggers who can sell a single tree for thousands of dollars. So when they cut down those old growth forests, they bring about the deforestation. They are actually destructing the habitat for those rare and endangered species that were supposed to live in that forest. There are certain harvesting methods that have been utilized for clear cutting of those forests. Most lumber and pulpwood in US and Canada, they are currently harvested by clear cutting, in which every tree in a given area is cut, regardless of whether it's small or large or medium sized tree. They are just clear cutting those trees. Some alternatives to clear cutting include the shelter wood harvesting. Shelter wood harvesting, in which mature trees are removed in a series of 2 or more cuts. And then we have one more kind of cutting down the trees, that's the strip cutting, in which all the trees in a narrow corridor are harvested. And the third kind of cutting down the trees, or we can say the harvesting method, is the selective cutting, in which only a small percentage of the mature trees are taken in each 10 or 20-year rotation. So this is the picture showing the clear cut process that has been occurred. For example, this larger clear cut such as this, it threatens the species that are dependent on those old growth forests and expose the steep slopes to soil erosion. So when there are no trees in here, there will be a rainfall and the soil will erode more rapidly because of this naked land. There are no trees in here, and when there is rainfall, there will be more soil erosion. So restoring something like the original forest will take hundreds of years. Roads and logging, some argue that logging should be restricted to privately owned lands. Just 4% of the nation's timber comes from those national forests, and this harvest adds only about $4 billion to the American economy per year. Or in contrast, we can say that recreation, fish and wildlife, clean water, and other ecological services that are provided by the forest by their calculations, they are worth at least $224 billion each year. So if we compare those ecological services to the American economy, that's by cutting down or by logging those forests, that gives us about $4 billion. So there is a huge difference. Timber industry officials, on the other hand, they claim that, arguing that logging not only provides the jobs and supports for rural communities, but they also keep the forests healthy. Is road building a good activity, or it's a bad activity for, or it's not uh, good for the forests? So it's a controversy. So over the past 40 years, the Forest Service has expanded its system of logging roads more than tenfold, a current total of nearly 550,000, or more than 10 times in length of those interstate highway system. Roads on public lands, they are very controversial. Over President Clinton put a stop to the road building when he was in office. So President George Bush reinstated road building. In 2009, President Obama reinstated the roadless rule. He noted that in this measure protects habitat for about 1,600 endangered species, including the bears and owls, and watersheds for 60 million people. Following a series of disaster fire years in the 1930s, the US Forest Service adopted a policy of aggressive fire control, and Smokey Bear was adopted as the forest mascot. Recent studies suggest that our attempts to suppress all fires may have been misguided, but many biological communities are actually those fire adapted and require the periodic burning for regeneration. Eliminating the fire from these forests, it has allowed the woody debris to accumulate, greatly increasing the chances of a very big fire. By suppressing the fires and allowing the fuel to accumulate, we make major fires such as this more likely. The safest and most ecologically sound management policy for some forests may be to allow the natural or prescribed fires which don't threaten the property or human life to burn uh, periodically. Let's now discuss about the ecosystem management. In 1990s, the U.S. Forest Service it began to shift its policies from timber production focus to ecosystem management, which actually attempts to integrate those sustainable ecological, economic, and social goals in unified and system approach. Let's talk about the grasslands in detail. After forests, the grasslands are among the biomes that are most heavily used by the humans. We have the prairies, the savannas, steppes, open woodlands, and other grassland that occupy about one quarter of the world's land surface. Much of the US Great Plains and prairie provinces of Canada, they fall in this category. It has been found that about 3.8 billion hectare of pastures and grazing lands in this biome make up about twice the area of all agriculture crops. Although these grasslands they may appear to be uniform and monotonous to the eye, but native prairies can be highly productive and species rich. According to US Department of Agriculture, more threatened plant species occur in rangelands than in any other major American biome. How the grazing can be sustainable or damaging. When the land is abused by overgrazing, especially you can see that in the arid areas, the rains run off quickly before it can soak into the soil to nourish the plants or replenish their groundwater. The springs and wells they dry up. Seeds cannot germinate in the dry, overheated soil. The barren ground reflects more of the sun's heat, changing those wind patterns or driving away the moisture laden clouds and leading to the further desiccation. This process is ancient, but in recent years it has been accelerated by expanding populations and political conditions that lead people to overuse fragile lands. The highest percentage of moderate, severe, and extreme land degradation you can see in Mexico and Central America, while the largest total area is in Asia, where the world's most extensive grasslands occur. It's possible to repair those degraded grasslands, but it requires reduced rates of grazing and careful management. Overgrazing also threatens the many rangelands. As in the case in many countries, most public grazing lands in the United States are not in good health. Political and economic pressures they encourage managers to increase grazing allotments beyond the carrying capacity of the range. The Natural Resource Defense Council claims that only about 30% of public rangelands are in good condition, and it has been found that 55% are poor or very poor. Overgrazing is a damage to vegetation and soil, including the loss of native forage species and also the erosion. Wildlife conservation groups regard the cattle overgrazing as the most ubiquitous form of ecosystem degradation and the greatest threat to endangered species in the southwestern US. Here in this figure, you can see the cattle grazing on the public grazing land. So more than half of all publicly owned grazing land in United States is in poor or very poor conditions. So overgrazing and invasive weeds are the biggest problems for this. There are certain ranchers that are experimenting with new methods that how uh, we can restore those grazing lands. Uh, One method is the rotational grazing. That means the confining animals to a small area for a shorter time. And then before shifting them to a new location, it simulates the effects of the wild herds. Restoring fire can be as beneficial to grasslands as it's to forests. In some places, farmers and ranchers, they find that short-term intensive grazing helps maintain the forage quality. As South African range specialist Alan Savory observed that wild ungulates, that means the hoofed animals such as the zebras in Africa or bison in America, they often tend to form dense herds that graze briefly but intensively in a particular location before they move to the next area. So this kind of rotational grazing, that means which is confined to a small area for a shorter time before they move to the other area. This can be beneficial for the ranchers. Rest alone doesn't necessarily improve pastures and rangelands, forcing livestock to eat everything equally, to trample the ground thoroughly, and to fertilize heavily with manure before they move on help keeps the weeds in check and encourage the growth of more desirable forage species. Restoring fire can be as beneficial to grasslands as it is to the forest. In some cases, the ranchers are cooperating with environmental groups in ranch management and preservation of a ranching community or the ranching economy. Another approach to ranching in some areas is to raise the wild species. For example, we have the impala, the wild beast, oryx, or which are more efficient foragers. These animals forage more efficiently, tolerate harsh climates often, and are more pest and disease resistant. And they fend off the predators better than usual domestic livestock. That was all about the grasslands. Now, moving to the parks and preserves, most forest and grasslands serve useful or utilitarian purposes. Most societies also set aside some natural areas for aesthetic or recreational purposes. National preserves have existed for thousands of years. Ancient Greeks, they protected the sacred groves for religious purposes. Some royal hunting grounds have preserved forests in Europe for centuries. Also, these areas were usually reserved for elite classes in society. They have maintained the biodiversity and natural landscapes in regions where most of the lands are heavily used. The first public park open to ordinary citizens have been the tree-sheltered agoras in planned Greek cities. But the idea of providing natural space for recreation and to preserve those natural environments has developed in the past 50 years. While the first parks were intended mainly for the recreation, today we can see our national parks as playgrounds for rest and recreation, as havens for wildlife, as places to experiment with ecological management, and as also as opportunities to restore those ecosystems. Currently, nearly 17% of the land area of Earth is protected in some of the parks, preserves, or wildlife management area. This represents about 25 million square kilometer in 236,204 different preserves. So this is an encouraging environmental success story. Many countries have also created nature preserves. In some strict nature preserves where particularly sensitive wildlife or natural features are located, human entry may be limited only to scientific research groups that visit on rare occasions. In some wildlife sanctuaries, for example, only a few people per year are allowed to visit. Why is it so? To avoid the introducing invasive species or disrupting those native species. The United States has only about 22% of its land area in protected status, and less than one third of amount is in IUCN categories. First or second, we can say that means the nature reserves or wildlands areas or national parks. The rest is in national forest or wildlife management zones that are designated for sustainable use. Currently, Brazil has the largest total area and protected status of any country. So, more than 2.5 million square kilometer, or 29% of nation's land, mostly in the Amazon basin, is in some protected status. So this is a picture that's the Canada's Quint Park National Park. A country with a very large resort area is Canada's this Quinte Park National Park on Ellesmere Island. It's an example of a preserve with high wilderness values but little biodiversity. Only 800 kilometers from the North Pole, this remote park gets fewer than 100 human visitors per year during its brief 3 week summer season. With little evidence of human occupation, it has abundant solitude and stark beauty, but very little wildlife and almost no vegetation. Serious problems that threaten the natural resources and environmental quality in many countries. When the U.S. National Park Service was established in 1916, Stephen Mather, the first director, reasoned that he needed to make the parks comfortable and entertaining for tourists as a way of building public support. So what he did, he created an extensive work of a network of roads in the largest park so that visitors could view famous sites from the windows of their automobiles, and he encouraged construction of grand lodges in which the guests could stay in luxuries. Wild animals have always been one of the major attractions in national parks. Many people lose all common sense, as you can see here in this when interacting with those big, dangerous animals. So, thousands of people that wait for an eruption of Old Faithful Geyser in Yellowstone National Park. So, our national parks are actually becoming congested. We have the off road vehicles that create the pollution, noise, and erosion in many parks. Marine ecosystem needs greater protection. As ocean fish stock becomes increasingly depleted globally, biologists are calling for protected areas where the marine organisms they are sheltered from destructive harvest methods. Although 5% of nearshore marine biomass are protected, as the opening case study we had already studied that in chapter 1, it describes limiting the amount and kind of fishing in marine reserves that can quickly replenish fish stocks in surrounding areas. In a study of about 100 marine refuges around the world, researchers found that on an average, the number of organisms that inside no take preserves was twice as high as surrounding areas. Recent research has shown that closing those reserves to fishing, even for a few months, can have beneficial results in restoring marine populations. The coral reefs, which are at a great damage, they can take a century or more to recover from that damage. Coral reefs are among the most biologically rich and endangered ecosystems in the world. Marine reserves are being established in many places to preserve and protect these uh, irreplaceable resources. Some parks take the draconian measures to expel the residents and prohibit the trespassing. People in some developing countries are beginning to realize that their biological resources may be their most valuable assets and their preservation is vital for sustainable development. Ecotourism has been considered, so that's the tourism that's ecologically and socially sustainable. They can be more beneficial in many places over the long term than the extractive industries such as logging and mining. So Switching to ecotourism is which is ecologically and socially sustainable tourism can be more beneficial in many of the places. Native people can play important role in nature protection. According to author Alan Durning, encoded in indigenous languages, customs, and practices may be understanding of nature as stored in libraries of modern science. Other countries recognize that finding ways to integrate local human needs with those of nature is essential for successful conservation. Many of the approximately 5,000 native cultures that remain today possess ancient ecological knowledge that can be valuable in ecosystem management. UNESCO's Man and Biosphere program, it encourages the designation of biosphere reserves. That means the protective areas are divided into zones with different purposes. This program, the MAB program, that's the Man and Biosphere program, it recognizes the indigenous rights while still protecting the environmental features. Ecotourism and research facilities are located in a relatively pristine buffer zone around the core, while the sustainable resource harvesting and permanent habitation are allowed in multiple use peripheral regions. Many national parks and preserves are increasingly isolated. The remnant fragments of ecosystem that once extended over large areas. So as park ecosystems are shrinking, they are becoming more and more important for maintaining biological diversity. Given human needs and pressures, however, big preserves are not always possible. One proposed solution has been to create the corridors, like here you can see in this figure, of natural habitats. The corridors of these natural habitats that can connect to the smaller habitat areas. Corridors could effectively create a large preserve from smaller ones. So corridors could also allow populations to maintain the genetic diversity or expand into new breeding territory. The effectiveness of these corridors probably depends on how long and wide they are and how readily a species will use them. A dramatic experiment that was carried out in reserve size, shape, and isolation in the Brazilian rainforest. In this experiment, it was a project that was funded by the World Wildlife Fund and Smithsonian uh, Institution. Loggers left about 23 test sites when they clear cut a forest. Test sites range from about 1 hectare to 10,000 hectares. Clear cuts surround some and newly created pasture surrounds. Other remain connected to the surrounding forest. Selected species are regularly inventoried to monitor their survival after the disturbance. So as expected, you can see that some species, they disappear very quickly, especially from the smaller areas. So sun-loving species, they flourish in the newly created forest edges, but deep forest shade-loving species, they disappear, particularly when the size and shape of a reserve reduces the availability of that habitat. This experiment demonstrated the importance of maintaining the core habitat in the preserves. Concluding this chapter, forests and grasslands, we already talked about that they cover about 60% of global land area. The vast majority of humans, they live in these biomes and we obtain many valuable materials from them. And yet these biomes are the source of much of the world's biodiversity on which we depend for life supporting ecological services. So how we can live sustainably on our natural resources while preserving enough nature so those resources can be replenished represents one of the most important questions in the environmental science. There is also some good news in our search for a balance between exploitation and preservation. Although the deforestation and land degradation are continued at unacceptable rates, particularly in some developing countries, but there are many places that have densely forested and they were also 2 centuries ago. So protection of those indigenous rights and biodiversity always have to struggle with the forces that want to exploit those natural resources. Overall, at least 17% of the Earth's land area is now in some part of protected status, although the level of protection in these preserves varies. We have not settled the debate between the focusing on individual endangered species and settling aside representative samples of habitat. But pursuing both strategies seems to be working. So, protecting charismatic umbrella organisms such as orangutans that we talked about in when we started this chapter, those orangutans in Indonesia or caribou in Alaska can result in preservation of innumerable unseen species. At the same time, protecting world landscapes for aesthetic or recreational purposes can also be achieved at the same end. That was all about today's chapter. Thank you.